Welcome, friends. It's May 18th of 2024, and this is another meditation in transformations. As I used to do in the past, I want to read to you a brief definition of transformation and transformational foresight, because that's what these videos are all about. And so, transformation is an evolutionary pathway of all living things. All things transform if they're alive. Transformational foresight is the expansion of consciousness across and beyond time, space, and experience. And then transformations itself is the co-creation of novel realities and greater states of regenerative care and love. And this leads into our transformations retreat. Let me turn that off, which is going to be this September 16th through the 18th in Waldoboro, Maine. Why Waldoboro, Maine? It seems like such an obscure place, but it's not, because it's where Topsail Farms is located, another beautiful retreat location for us by the river, in the woods, in a barn, in glamping around the campfire, where we will be able to talk about exactly what I want to talk about briefly in this video today, and that is that good foresight leads to whole sight and not poor sight. What do I mean by that? Well, let me just read to you briefly from an article that I was looking at this week, which reminded me of another article that I love that is a part of our Transformations Retreat, because we talk about so many wonderful things there. Everybody comes together and they ought to all bring, their expertise together. And that's exactly feeding into this idea of whole sight tonight, because not one of us has the answer or the picture. We are the parts that make the whole, and the whole is within the parts. And the whole emerges to direct the parts, and the parts remain diverse, but then understand their place in the whole. It's actually a beautiful picture. And it leads me back to the idea of holoptic, H-O-L-O-P-T-I-C, holoptic foresight dynamics, which is the foundation of our Transformations Retreat and the holoptic foresight philosophy, which undergirds natural foresight, wicked opportunities, everything that we do at TFSX, but that so many others are doing around the world now too, leads me exactly to my article tonight. This is an article that was written by an evolutionary philosopher who lives in Germany named Jessica Baum. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. Because I know that I don't know how to pronounce names very well. So it's my fault if the name's not right, of course. And she wrote a recent article, or I guess fairly recent. It's called, I think it was at the end of last year actually, called On the Struggle of Finding Your Place in the World. And in the article, she expounds on the meta crisis of climate change and gender inequality and collapsing governmental development and disconnection from living systems, and just the list goes on and on, food inequalities, on and on and on. And yet she very smartly aligns with the great philosopher Jonathan Rowson, whose channel Perspective, if you've never watched before, is amazing. Has many other philosophers on there who talk about some pretty great things. And Jessica and Jonathan, by the way, just side note, have a good understanding of the fact that I think a lot of people today say philosophy. I don't care about philosophy. I want to get things done. But there is no correct doing without deep philosophical knowing. And it's one of the things that our Western society has done, is stripped philosophy or deeper knowing from the doing that is really going to lead us to some healthy, powerful, regenerative things. And so therefore, because we've stripped philosophy out, we do without knowing. And that's a sad state of affairs. And as a part of what she talks about in this article on the struggle of finding your place in the world, and I just want to read a couple of quotes from it. She says, looking back now, she's talking about her own life, I see that the reason why I couldn't find my place in the environmental, climate, or animals rights movement was because of the parts in the whole. What does it mean? And then she says, while our dominant mechanistic paradigm trains us to focus on the parts, our dominant narrative, our linear mechanistic dominant narrative today, our extractive, exploitative, exponential, extrapolative, consumerist, consumptive, dominant narrative says the parts are what matter. And we've stripped out the whole. This is a disembodiment or deracination of living from living systems, right? This incapacity to concentrate on specific parts is often disrespected in our Western society, and so people are driven to look at the parts only. But we live in a society that encourages us to specialize in diversification and not the whole. And then she says, I've talked to many people who find it similarly challenging to find their part in the whole. I also found that those people are gifted with a very good sense of the systematic relational nature of the world. They intuitively grasp the whole and are overwhelmed by the immensity and ingraspable nature of this hyper object known as the whole. A hyper object is anything that, by the way, that's so hard for us to grasp. It's so big, it's beyond our knowing from our small colloquial lives that we had before. When you think about nuclear bombs and climate change and these usually big, scary things, they're hyper objects and they're hard for us to grasp. The meta crisis, the poly crisis, the perma crisis is a hyper object. When we think about it in terms of things are crisis. But as I was saying a few minutes ago, as Jonathan, the philosopher that she quotes earlier, then as Jessica herself says in this article, the meta crisis is neither really meta or a crisis. Because when we understand our relation to the whole, then the crisis disperses and we understand that this is us having to go through something. There's no going around it. And a lot of our work today, even our work in Foresight, is an attempt to go around, to find a way to go around, to stay in the sunshine, to bring things out of the fog into the light. And where all of the goodness is in the fog and staying in the fog. Because that's where all of the goodness is. Life is in the fog, not outside the fog. She talks about Ian McGilchrist because he talks about this a good bit, and he says, he argues that our society's heavy emphasis on left-brain cognition, which focuses on the parts and is untrained and often incapable of accessing the right, which perceives the whole, is a big mistake. She says, I concur with McGilchrist's observation that Western industrialized society had developed a fragmentary approach that fixates on dissecting and understanding isolated parts, losing sight of the interconnected whole. Now let's skip forward a little bit. Because she goes on to say, and this is so important, we want to be in relation to the whole, and yet we don't know how. Because as described above, the whole remains unattainable and we are never fully able to make real contact with the meta crisis. That's if we view things that way. Don't worry, the whole is attainable. We long to relate to something that seems to be unable to relate to, like the whole. Because of the environment we're in, because of the dominant narrative, it strips us from being able to grasp that. We're fighting these two systems, right? Or these two realities. Or one reality and one non-reality. This deep longing and drive to relate is what various authors refer to as eros, the erotic. And we do not like that in the Western society. We do everything to get rid of the erotic. We see it as being gross and sinful, the erotic. But what we need back in our lives, and in Foresight and Wholesight, is the erotic, because the erotic is the connection to the whole. The eros is our drive to connect, to be deep within something, to be erotic. This deep longing and drive to relate is what various authors refers to eros or the erotic. Eros is no simple biological instinct or natural force. It is inherently metaphysically cosmic and divine. Through forging new connections, novelty emerges, and that's what eros does. Alfred North Whitehead asserts that the constant emergence of novelty is the very nature of eros. The constant emergence of novelty, this sounds like Foresight, is the nature of eros. This is why I wrote before that Foresight has the power to create a revolution of care, equity, reconciliation, and love. And that we can live by those things, and Foresight gives us the cosmic consciousness to be able to do that. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here in her article. And she says, for me, the challenge has always been to perceive the whole within the parts rather than the other way around, a too narrow focus on the parts, which is common in a world dominated by a mechanistic worldview. We need to be able to perceive the whole. And so I wanted to skip over to, and I hope this would encourage you to join us at our Transformations Retreat, because this is exactly what we want to talk about. Because the Dragonfly's journey, that's what Transformations Retreat is all about. The Dragonfly's journey, what is it? The dragonfly has a holoptic eye. You've seen this before. I know, I'm just going through it again because I want you to relate it to an article that I just read from. The dragonfly's eye is a holoptic eye made of many individual fragments or nodes or parts, but all of the parts connecting to a whole or a way to see in time, space, and experience that we don't have with a very singular eye. Physically, I'm talking about now. But metaphorically, we can develop through the cooperative evolutionary trait. By the way, Jessica talks about the evolutionary part too as eco-philosophy. Nora Bateson uses this word symathesy, which is a mutual learning context. That the parts mutually learn together and aren't disconnected, and it's an evolutionary movement toward trans-contextual wholes. The symathesy. This is where good foresight is practiced. Because our foresight today is often in service to those mechanized systems that see only the parts. That's why we're so fascinated with trends. Instead of the bigger trans-contextual movement of what is novelly appearing. Novelly? That's not a word. But novel, the appearance of novelty. Novel appearance. I like novelty. That's what it works for me. So when we think of that symathesy, that mutual contextual learning, then we're back to the dragonfly's journey, the many, many, many nodes that make up one big eye that can see time, space, and experience very differently. And so back to us again, can we ever get that? Yes, we can, because evolution is not just individual, it's collective. And a cooperative, collective, and collaborative evolutionary trait of perceiving. So the I that I'm talking about is not our individual eyes. I saw a trend. That guy on the stage is a futurist. They saw a trend. But it's a collective and cooperative understanding that that's how we really see things. It's not individually, but collectively, cooperatively, collaboratively. And when we think of evolution as moving away from the individual to the collective, then there's a collective or cooperative evolutionary trait that's emerging that allows us to perceive emerging novelty. What we just heard from Jessica in this article, how to see the whole. That then, once the cooperative, collective, collaborative perceives what wants to emerge, novel emergence, then that fosters, supercharges the co-creation of transformational realities. We hear so many people today talking about systemic transformation and moving away from incremental problem solving. What we need today is systemic transformation. And so that trans-contextual learning moves us into the whole, and the whole perceives what wants to emerge. So that's what I wanted to leave you with right now, because I wanted to share with you this brief definition of holopticism, in case you're just lost on that part. That's why I like to call it the dragonfly's journey. We can break it all down, come to the retreat, or any one of our, by the way, this week coming up, May 22nd, if you're where I live, it's early in the morning, it's 5 a.m. But if you're in other parts of the world, then you're more safe. But there's going to be a wonderful, wonderful panel of 7 people, 8 including me, 9 including Sarah Owen, that are going to be talking about foresight at the end of the world. At the end of one world, this world that Jessica was talking about, the parts, and the beginning of a new world, a world of the whole. A world where we move through the meta-crisis, not of things, but of the heart. A crisis of the heart, which is no crisis of all. It is us having to move through into something new, from one state to another, right? And that's what the holistic eye does. It sees time, space, and experience very differently and perceives what wants to emerge. In a holistical context, the individual knows what to do because she gets informed by the whole. But this is beautiful because it doesn't mean anybody loses their diversity. Diversity is key here because if we don't have the diverse parts, you'll never have a healthy whole. The whole is made up of many trans-contextual parts, mutual communication, mutual context of learning, trans-contextual wholes, trans-contextual learning, unlearning, relearning. Actions don't need to come from a blind chain of command, top down, linear, mechanistic. They don't come that way. They emerge out of the parts and the whole inside the parts. It's not a chain of command. Individual and collective actions emerge at crossroads of agreements, roles, individual personalities and styles, the current configuration on the field, trans-contextual learning, synapthy, exactly what Jessica Bohm was talking about, and this idea of the holistic dragonfly's eye. Communication. Every individual action modifies the whole. Oh, wow. Individual actions modify the ever-emerging whole, which in turn, the whole as a unique emerging entity, a living entity, a collective, cooperative, collaborative entity itself. Let's get away from toxic individualism. We're only full in the whole, in the cooperative, the collaborative, the collective. The whole then in return informs the players, the actors, what to do next, in their diverse voices, in their diverse communication, in that beautiful erotic place where the communication comes together. An unceasing feedback loop, parts to whole, wholes to parts, parts to whole, wholes to parts, allows for the individual and the collective to communicate with one another. I'm going to leave you right there. And I will see you next time on Meditation and Transformations. Bye-bye.